got a pretty compelling demo around this because so much has happened around Data API Builder. But let me just start by talking about, who I am so we can do everything formally here. My name is Jerry Nixon. So I am a product manager on the SQL Server team. Specifically, I am in the developer experiences team. And what we do is we focus on all of the features and tooling to reduce all of the friction and pain that developers have when they're implementing SQL Server. So for the longest time, and everybody on this call hopefully knows, SQL Server's been around for a long time. That's the reason it's so stable, so fast, and so everything else. And so that long history has really been a focus on the DBA, this sort of behind the scenes that understands the mechanics of all of SQL and is able to deploy it and set it up in a way to make it very successful. However, on the other side is the developer attempting to use it. And there's always been a little bit of a line between the two, whether or not you can see that, whether or not you can interact with the database when you're a developer, or it's just always this boundary that's broader than it needs to be. And part of the reason is our fault. SQL Server has focused specifically on the DBA and sort of left the developer out. The .NET team has come in and created Entity Framework and other tooling, and then the MVP community has come in and created other tooling as well to really help make it so that the developer's experience is easier and without any friction. But the truth of the matter, we have somewhat neglected the developer. So that's where I am, the developer experiences team. The developer experiences team is the opposite. It is focusing on the developer to make sure that their experience and adoption into SQL Server is a brand new story. And so for the last, I would say, about 4 years, this has been a significant investment from the SQL side. There are a lot of features that have been introduced now to Azure SQL and then flowed down into SQL Box that are specific to things that have been asked for by sometimes for years by our developer community, as well as different tooling, as well as different engines and libraries as well. And so I'll talk about quite a bit of those today, but I'll focus specifically on Data API Builder. All right, so this is me. I'm the Data API Builder product manager, as well as other things as well. But I am an intense Star Trek fan. So as we go through this, I will probably be talking about things with some analogies. And when I do, I might be talking about Star Trek analogies. So still a fan of Star Wars, just don't love it like I do Star Trek. So there you go. All right, let's take a little walk through history together. Not so long ago, 1999, we invented, and I say we, being Microsoft invented SOAP, and we're really the first to implement it on the broadest scale with deep integration into Visual Studio, making it so that if you wanted to interact with an API in any way, it was easy. SOAP was XML standard that made it so that you could create a client that could read the schema or the contract in those days, or the WSDL in those days that would be projected. And it was amazing, absolutely amazing. And because it was so good, and because this is the character of of Microsoft, because it was so good, we had to get rid of it. And so the next thing was REST. And so REST was a big difference in really just one specific way. It was JSON instead of XAML, of XML. And the reason that mattered was JSON was natively easier to use inside JavaScript applications. And so that made it really approachable. The downside is REST didn't have all the capability of SOAP. So it didn't have all of the security built in and all the transactional support that it had and all the contract support either, to be honest. But that's okay. We stuck to it because it felt like it was easier, even though it was definitely in its infancy and not working really the way that it was supposed to. But we know that as time passes, things change. One of the things that changed in 2009, we got a Star Trek reboot with Chris Pine. Turns out everybody hated it, and then everybody slowly started to love it. Now we love it again, right? It's funny how things change over time. A little bit like SOAP. It goes the opposite. Everybody loves it. Now everybody hates it. It's the funniest thing. Yet it's the most powerful of all the technologies, even still today. Okay, 2010, along comes OData. OData is attempting to fix the many things that weren't right with REST, including the ability to filter and sort and be able to get nested items as well that were very easy to solve in SOAP, but difficult to solve with REST. OData came along with all of that solution. It felt like we had really solved it. And because we were so close, we needed something else. So we took OData and we got rid of that as well. So OData is not gotten rid of. It's still the fundamental backbone between the for the Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph is how we would interact with the Microsoft 365. Sorry, we rename it all the time, so I forget. The Microsoft 365 endpoints, the most prolific and the most busy endpoints in the world, bar none, times 10. Absolutely true. And so in order to get to that capability and also that speed and also that all the things that were necessary to make that work, OData is there. They're certainly not going anywhere. So OData is locked into the world, if no other reason, because of the Microsoft Graph. And then along came GraphQL. GraphQL is a much more approachable graph solution, and it's actually graph. So the Microsoft Graph is not a graph, not in the sense that you would understand graph if you were creating a graph modal database. GraphQL is also not graph. GraphQL is a query language and an endpoint that supports that query language that allows you to write complex and nested queries against an HTTP endpoint and get back data from your SQL Server. All of this is interaction with the SQL Server, each one trying to make it easier, trying to expose different features and capabilities of the database. These aren't specific to SQL Server, of course, but I like to think that they are. And then jump forward today. Oh, it's 2025, not 2024. That's funny. That's unacceptable. Hang on just a second. We have to fix that. Going into my slides right now. That is hilarious. Today is 2020. There we go. 25. Did I fix it? 5 right there. All right, there we go. That's funny how it left a little 5 on the slide. Nonetheless, here we are today, and what has changed now? Nothing. So what we have seen 10 years later, which is really the longest gap, is GraphQL really hasn't caught on like we would have expected it to. On the one side, that's partly because there's a speed bump to adoption. On the other side, that's because REST really was good. Like it has really advanced to a point where people are satisfied with it, and people are willing, especially developers and engineers, are willing to give up certain capabilities in order to keep simplicity. And REST really has simplicity under its belt. All right, so where does a data API kind of fit into your architecture? It fits in a little bit like this. You would create a client and you would have a database and you would have an API in between. Now, a data API is different than a web API. A web API is all of your business logic wrapped up in a service layer. That's still very important, and that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about getting rid of that. We're talking about augmenting it. A data API is different because the data API is the direct way to interact with the database without talking to the database directly, right? It exposes the CRUD, C-R-U-D, operations against your database with all of the capabilities that you need as if you were talking to the database directly without talking to the database directly. Why would you have this extra layer and on top of your database? Well, let me just start with, this is the real world. Like the real world is enterprises have policies that say no one can talk to our database. That's the way it just really is. So we have data APIs on top of it, but data APIs give tons of capabilities back to us. They give us things like the ability to cache, the ability to have exotic security, the ability to fragment and break apart different pieces into different domains if we want them, the ability to scale in ways that we can't do with the database, and the way to kind of hide the database itself, right? So you could have a data API that you interact with very easily over HTTP with JSON, and everything is straightforward. And on the back end, you don't know if it's SQL, you don't know if it's MySQL, you don't know if it's Postgres, you don't know if it's Cosmos DB. You just know that you're interacting with a simple data API. So that's the other appeal. It simplifies both the abstraction of the database itself, but also gives features that you really wouldn't want to put in the database. And that would be your only option if you're going to the database directly. Part of the reason you wouldn't want to put those features, by the way, in the database is because they're so expensive there. Without a doubt, if you look at your entire architecture, the individual service or the individual block in your diagram that is the most expensive is almost certainly going to be your database. So if the only way to solve a problem is to scale your database, that is basically saying the only way to solve your problem is to scale the most expensive thing in your solution. So a data API solves that and helps not only solve the problem technically, but solve the problem with your budget as well. All right. So just as a reminder now, with the data API, when I'm talking to it, it's the simple way of talking over HTTP JSON. But the data API does the difficult part of talking the JSON to the database, or talking from the API with T-SQL over to the database. Now, you might think in your mind, I actually don't have a problem with writing SQL, Jerry. Everything is actually pretty easy. I don't need that translation to sell me on this. But that's not the rest of your dev team. The reality is, if you ask a random 1,000 developers and you're like, what are the 3 first languages you should learn? Let's say 5 first languages you should learn. SQL will not be in that list. In fact, half or maybe more of the audience that you're asking, once you say, why didn't you say SQL? Their response is going to be, what is SQL, right? So your familiarity with SQL really doesn't matter in this case, because we're trying to make it so we have this ubiquitous access across your entire development team from junior to senior. And so that's a big problem, by the way, because even as people are starting to learn to write their own SQL, at the beginning, they just write terrible SQL. I'm sure you've seen it even in your own experience, right? Where you just don't know all the tricks at the beginning. And so what if there are no tricks to JSON, by the way? So now I could write a JSON operation against my API. That API could write the T-SQL for me, and it's going to write the correct and most performant SQL as well. And so that's where Data API Builder comes in, by the way, because once you understand the importance of having a data API inside your architecture, now you understand why you would have it, and you are willing to bear the cost of building it. But Data API Builder is saying, don't build it. Let us build it for you. So Data API Builder basically says, by the way, your CRUD operations are so repetitive, it is exhausting. You probably have built services like this in the past, and when you build them again, you tend to go back to those previous projects, copy that code, bring it over, adjust it as necessary, and move on, right? It's this copy and paste inheritance that we have from one project to another, which means that any advancement in the approach probably isn't introduced. And the opportunity for bugs and things like that are always there, because the more lines of code you introduce to your code base, the more opportunity we have for any kind of flaw. So that's not where it stops. We also have this idea that now you have this code. Well, we have a rule in our enterprise, just like you have in your enterprise. If you're going to introduce code, it has to also be tested. So now we need the unit tests that test against their very simple and repetitive CRUD operations. Now we need to integrate that, by the way, into our CI/CD pipeline as well. So when you really look at a data API and you make it completely capable with all of the advanced features that you want to make sure that it has, you're probably introducing a third of your code base. And if you could take that away, you're probably removing a third of your code base. And that's where Data API Builder really kicks in. It says, listen, just don't build it. We know how to interact with SQL. We know how to interact with MySQL. We know how to interact with Postgres. We know how to interact with Cosmos DB. We can expose an endpoint for you, no problem. And you might think, well, earlier we were talking about the different technologies of like REST and GraphQL. Your team may have already decided that REST is going to be the standard for them. No problem, we expose REST endpoints. But you may have also said GraphQL is going to be the standard for your team. That's okay. We also expose that as well. So the idea of Data API Builder is not to force you into a pigeonhole that we want you to be in, but instead to kind of meet you where you are and give you as much capability as you can without having to make some sort of architectural compromise that maybe you've been pushed into because of the enterprise that you're working for right now. So this is not, by the way, code generation. Code generation is exhausting. It's not an ORM or anything along those lines. It is an engine that delivers these endpoints, and all you have to provide to it is a JSON configuration file that simply gives it access to the database and describes which of the tables, which of the views, or which of the stored procedures inside your database you're going to expose, just like you would do with a normal data API. And the nice thing about using an engine like this is that we have already spent the engineering cost to make sure that this is the experience that you want to have. So we have, for example, already implemented OpenAPI for you. So any of your consumers who want to build a client on top of your endpoints by using the information from OpenAPI can do that, right? A lot of people do. Maybe it's just documentation. You're going to use OpenAPI to generate documentation for your endpoint. Fine, we do that as well, right? And so here you have it. We have Swagger implemented as well. Each one of these things can be turned off and turned on, depending on what your needs are. We have Banana Cake Pop, which is delicious sounding. Banana Cake Pop is the Swagger for GraphQL. And because we deliver both GraphQL and Swagger, and REST, that's the reason we have both Swagger and Banana Cake Pop, so that you can test and implement this in the development setting before you deploy it into production. We have a full CLI, which means you can do everything at the command line, which means you can do everything inside your CI/CD pipeline. Whatever it is that you want to do, we enable that as well as a full suite of extensions inside Visual Studio Code. So when we get to the demo here in just a minute, you'll see that really it's the suite of these extensions that make everything so fast and so possible. So the title of this session is Build an Enterprise Data API and then take the rest of the day off. We do that anyway with the CLI. It's so fast and rapid to get a data API in place. If you needed a POC by the end of lunch, you could easily do it. And I'll show you here in just a second. Okay, and so what is it? If it's what do I mean by it's an engine? We deliver this to you as a free and open container, right? So you can download this or pull this into your local library of container images, or you can deploy this into your own cluster, or however it is you automate. However it is that you automate and orchestrate your containers. So maybe that's Kubernetes, maybe that's ACI, maybe that's ACA or something else. And you might be thinking, all right, but we don't even use Azure, but this runs everywhere. So if you don't use Azure but use the Google Cloud, fine, it runs there too. If you use Amazon, it runs there too. If you're not even in the cloud and you run on-prem, it runs there too. There are no requirements. If you don't use SQL Server and you only use Postgres, that's fine. That scenario is totally supported. And it's kind of a new world of Microsoft, isn't it? In the way that we kind of approach things. We're really trying to make it so we look, by the way, at these databases as the databases that are hosted inside Azure. So we want to make it as easy as possible, but we also recognize that not everybody's at the same place in their cloud journey. Some people are on-prem and will never go to the cloud. And some people are on-prem and they're on their way to the cloud. And so we're just trying to reduce all of the friction that we possibly can. It's completely open source and free. There's no license. There's no premium edition or anything like that. That's the reason it's so popular right now, right? It's because you could just take it and go. And because it's open source, it means you can also review the code and you can see there's nothing exotic here. There's nothing we've built that you wouldn't have done yourself if you only had the budget and you only had the manpower to actually accomplish it. So that's beautiful by itself. By the way, sometimes we're asked if it's GA. For open source, it's weird to say GA, but technically we are GA, which means that if you're a Microsoft customer, you can submit issues and we'll do our best to treat them as if they're bugs inside an actual project. But we also handle 99% of everything through issues inside the repository so that we can manage everything, not only in a structured way, but in front of everybody so everybody knows what's going on. And if you go there now to akms/dab, if you go there now, and look at our repository, you'll just see we are busy bees. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. Okay, some things to know about Data API Builder. The first is we deliver both Graph and REST, not one or the other, which this is why that matters. A lot of development teams are already standardized on REST, but willing to look at GraphQL. But what they don't want to do is invest completely in GraphQL yet. They want to sort of dabble with it, maybe just a screen or two, or maybe just a sub-client that they are writing they want to use GraphQL against. But in order to do that in the real world without Data API Builder, you then have to go and build all the custom resolvers to make that work. So in this case, if you're using Data API Builder, we just turn it on. And now you have both Graph and REST, so you can start dabbling in Graph and decide if that's a good path for you. That is unbelievable. You could go the other way too. If you've standardized in Graph, you could do that and then turn on REST very slowly. It's kind of up to you. And by the way, when you expose different entities or different tables and views and store procedures, you can individually turn on each of those. So one of them is Graph, one of them is REST, whatever it makes sense to you in your overall architecture. So just a quick reminder, a little refresher here of the way REST works, right? The reason people love REST is because you can pass in at the bottom there, those are the the methods or the verbs that you're going to interact with the endpoint. And it's just, you can do a lot of this even in the browser, and you could do it inside Postman or in Insomnia or the new HTTP testing tools that are built into Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. It's so easy to use. It's extremely popular. So we have the verb like post. We have the path, that would be the entity that you go to, right? It would be /API/user or whatever the table name is. And then you can pass in this body of things that you want to insert, update, or modify. You don't need a body for delete. For delete, you just say the ID, right? So we do everything standard. It's the way you would see this in a typical API. In fact, inside Microsoft, I say inside, but it's public. We have a standard of how we build APIs, making it so that all the APIs that Microsoft produces should be the same, like structurally. That's what we deliver, right? A structurally consistent set of data APIs. So you don't even need to go somewhere and say, what are going to be our API standards? You can just adopt the ones that we have implemented hundreds of thousands of times. So that's really nice. Another is just that's another refresher. I mean, is GraphQL. If you've never seen it, almost everything is through Post. And then you say what the endpoint is. So in this case, it's /GraphQL. And this is how it's different than REST. REST has several endpoints, one for every table or view or whatever. GraphQL only has one, just this /GraphQL. And then you pass in a query, and that query, which is structured somewhat like JSON, but it is its own language, is then translated into SQL on the back end, which means I can ask for any record while going to this single endpoint. That's one of the reasons it's very appealing. It has its own schema that it passes back, so you can have intelligence and all kinds of knowledge on the client side of what's available to you inside the GraphQL endpoint. And then you can also have both queries and mutations. And the only separation there is that the query returns data and makes no changes. The mutation also returns data, but does make changes, or at least can make changes if you want to. And it's really there for segregating your schema, so it's simpler, and also so that you can have security around it, so that you can have query has one set of security and mutation has another. So it just depends on if you've never seen GraphQL, it's pretty neat. By the way, if you're a .NET developer today, and you're wanting to implement your own GraphQL server, you would use Hot Chocolate. That's the library that everybody uses. If you're wanting to do it on the client side and consume one, right? You don't care now what the library or technology is on the server. You just want to consume it from a .NET client. Then you use the Strawberry Shake library, right? So that's really nice. There are no libraries for REST. Again, that's one of the reasons a lot of people go that direction. Because you can always use a library if you're just into using libraries, but the truth of the matter is it only takes 2 or 3 lines and you've got everything done. All right, one other thing to know. Maybe I freaked you out just a little bit when I talked about containers and deploying this into either Kubernetes or ACI or ACA, Azure Container Apps or Azure Container Instances, or whatever it is you're using to orchestrate all of your containers. Maybe you don't want to do that. You don't have to. So we have one other option, and that's static web apps. Static web apps allows you to define your configuration file, and that's it. Pass it back up to static web apps as a Azure service. It will automatically for you then deploy the container. It's hidden from you, right? Everything is easy and made no knobs to turn, so you get what you get. But everything is just in place. We have tons of customers who adore this because they didn't want to stand up Kubernetes. They didn't want to figure out ACA. They just wanted to get everything working. So it's really amazing. Static web apps allows you to create, of course, a static web app like a website, written in React or Blazor or whatever, and then or both because they're not mutually exclusive. And then to deploy a data API, and then also you could deploy an Azure function all wrapped up inside of free, and it's free. That's what's crazy about static web apps too. It doesn't have the database itself, right? You would still create a SQL database, but it's worth pointing out that Azure SQL database is also now free. And so you can go in and create your own free instance. Every subscription, no matter what type of subscription it is, even the pay-as-you-go free subscription, can have 10 free SQL servers, right, with 32 gigabytes of storage and 100,000 vCore compute seconds. So it's incredibly powerful. If you're just wanting to stand this up and see what it looks like, or you're wanting to just like dabble and build out an application or simple mobile application, it's all just sitting there waiting for you. It's absolutely incredible. All right. Another thing to at least talk about is how easy to manage all of this is. And so I want to start by just saying that if you have a serious API, not just data API, but API, so the API is both web API and data API, then you really need to have API Manager in the mix somehow, right? So one way or another. It makes everything nice and simple. So for example, if you wanted to extend DAB to have some sort of custom functionality that was outside of the CRUD operations, you could make that transparent by using API Manager. But by the way, API Manager is a service inside Azure, but there are tons of API Manager libraries that give you the same capability that you could run. Many of them are free, and so or an open source and free, and you can just stand them up the way that you want to. The reason API Manager inside Azure is nifty is partly because it's just sitting there waiting for you. But you don't have to, like, all of this is not a compound budget impact, that's for sure. All right, so if you're not using API Manager, I'd like to know why. I would honestly like, maybe you're using App Gateway. That's kind of like API Manager. That's the same thing. But this is such an important step with any API strategy that I hope that if you take away anything from this session, it's that API Manager should be in your solution one way or another. So cool way that you can deploy, and there's so many architectural options with Data API Manager. I'm sorry, with Data API Builder, with the Data API Builder. Because it's so small, it's tiny little I mean, when you pull it down and put it into your image library at Docker, it'll happen immediately because it's very tiny. And so because it's so small, you can deploy it as many times as you want with very little impact to the overall structure and like load of your solution. So if you have a microservices solution and you're like, what I would really like to do is have really small databases with really small data APIs. And what I'd really, really like to do is enable all of those with just a single JSON file so I don't have to have a repeating code base over and over again. No problem. By the way, when security practices change and when different libraries need to be updated, or the data API, with the .NET runtime needs to be upgraded, or because it's fallen out of support or whatever it is, isn't it nice that you can have it just isolated inside a container and know that we on the DAB team are updating all of these things for you with a very, very keen eye to backwards compatibility and breaking changes to make sure that you can just constantly upgrade over and over and over again to make sure that all of these little microservices, let's say this has 4, but let's say you have 40, and what a hassle it is to keep everything up to date. But if your containers are already ephemeral containers, meaning they go down and up on their own, and while they're down, they're subject to being updated, which is a normal process, by the way, then all of a sudden, you don't even need to schedule a maintenance window to ensure that everything gets upgraded. Because you're using the DAB engine, you just know that even if you ignore your solution for a year and come back, it's been upgraded while you were waiting. It's really, really amazing. So we support microservices in the typical architecture, but let's say you're more of a domain-driven sort of process where you have a pretty good-sized database or two. It doesn't have to be the same database. And but instead, you're going to break apart your data APIs, not in microservices, but instead now in perspectives of what you're going to actually operate in which domain. And so now I've intentionally, let's just say you've segmented your database by schema to represent every domain. Now you could have 4 schemas represented by 4 endpoints. Each one is not introducing another multiple of complexity to your solution. It just enables the overall pattern that you want to enable, that you want to expose, right? So it's really, really nice. You can go to those individually, or I have it shown here if you use API Manager to make it so that they have a kind of a fluid availability to the client. So you could make it so that the client goes to them directly, not going through API Manager. I just want to go back a couple of slides in concept. If you're not using API Manager, I'd really like to know why, because it solves so many problems, especially from a security point of view. And that also makes it, by the way, if I've broken these out in different domains, let's say that top one is the most important domain, I could actually scale up that container to be a little bit bigger to make sure that it operates a little bit faster than the one, let's say at the very bottom, which is the one that's barely used. And so I want to make sure that it doesn't take up or consume any of my resources beyond what's really necessary. So it's a great way to just have the flexibility that you want. What's changed inside Data API Builder to make all this work? Nothing. You're just implementing your own topology in a way that makes sense to you. All right. The other thing you might be able to do is say, let's have a single endpoint, but let's point it at different databases. I have several databases inside my organization or inside my department. I want to make them all feel and look as if they are just one. And so I realized that one of them is an older SQL, one of them is a newer SQL, one of them is a Postgres database, and another one is a MySQL database. Let's just pretend you're suffering in a situation like that. Those sorts of things actually do happen. Now you have a data API that completely isolates away all of the specialized technology and makes it so that I am pointing to each of those databases transparently behind the scenes. The client interacting with my data API makes it feel like my enterprise is a unified data experience, right? That's what you really want to be able to do. That's hugely powerful. And so multiple data sources from a single data API. That means I can have my configuration file, my JSON file, and I can give that to the engine and say point it to a database. But the way this works is I can actually provide then another configuration file, and then another configuration file, and then another configuration file. And the engine doesn't care how many configuration files you give it. So you can give it 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's no upper limit. There is a practical upper limit, but it has to do with the size of your container, not Data API Builder. But what's great is it's not a bunch of like kooky configuration. It's the same configuration you had for one database. You just repeat it for the others and provide it to the engine, and now they're all exposed. The only requirement on your side as you're doing something like this is to make sure that the endpoint you're exposing are unique. So if you have two, let's just say log tables if you have a log table in every database, you're going to make sure that the endpoint, the REST endpoint or the graph type name is unique, right? So they don't clash. So when you ask for log, you know which one you're getting. Other than that, it's completely done for you, right? It's really, really cool. It makes it so, by the way, if you're migrating from one database type to another database type, you can put a data API like this in front of it. And as you migrate from one to another, and you're updating these configuration files to point to from one place to another, the user on the other side never has to change the way that they're interacting with your data API. And it really is a transparent migration for them. So very cool way to do that. And of course, because I said Data API Builder can run in the cloud or it can run on-prem, you could also make it so you're doing multiple data sources, and some of those data sources are in on-prem for you, and some of them are up in the cloud. That makes it so now my data API is returning hybrid data completely invisible from the user. I can either do that at every endpoint calls to a different, or if I'm using GraphQL where I can request multiple types at one time, I can actually make it so that in a single request, I get back data from both cloud and on-prem databases, right? And what type of database doesn't matter. All you have to make sure is that from a networking point of view, you have access to it from where you are. So really, really cool. A couple of other features that make it so that the database is operating better. We have level 1 cache. I'll just go ahead and just jump to level 2 cache is right around the corner. We're working on it right now. Level 1 cache is in-memory cache. Level 1 cache that gives you a single second of cache, right? So let's not talk about big amounts of cache, like cache that takes 5 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, whatever like that. We support that as long as your container remains alive. What 1 second cache gives you is that when you have concurrent requests to the same endpoint, those concurrent requests are allowed to share the result and make it so that your database, your endpoint might get 200 simultaneous concurrent requests for the same data. Let's say you're exposing data that's a list of states, a list of countries, a list of employees, something that doesn't change in a single second. So now I have all of my users. I have 1,000 users in my company. They're all asking for it simultaneously. 1,000 simultaneous requests for all the products in my company. and the first one has to call to the database and ask for it. The other 999 get the cache that is returned, right? That's what I want to happen. So now all of them, by the way, they don't have to wait for the execution operation to complete. The first one does, because you can't get around the actual physics of it. So that person has to wait, let's say it's 1 second, to get all of the products in my company. And then all of the other 999 experience a sub-second return, because that data is just sitting in RAM, which is incredibly fast, and there are no joins or anything else. Right? So now you've made it so the user's experience is unbelievably good. And now the database, it only knows of a single query that even happened, and yet it served 1,000 users. Right? So you definitely want to look at cache, even if you're only looking at a single second of cache. If you have cache enabled, if you have cache available, let me say it this way, then you cannot ignore the fact that you should be enabling it, right? If you have it available, you must enable it. It is incredible. The exception would be if you're NASDAQ and you need to have sub-second accuracy to whatever your stock price is. Aside from that, which is the rest of us, cache is an amazing thing. By the way, level 2 cache is when it's outside of the container. We use a backplane and we use something like Redis, and that's right around the corner here, so it'll be exciting too. Especially important if your containers are short-lived, right? That's when it's really, really valuable. From a security point of view, obviously security is going to be our first option. I probably should have had this as my leading slide. And so the very first thing we do is we enable intra ID. We also support all custom JOT tokens. So if you have a JOT server inside your solution that just passes around claims to make sure that the user has explicit access to every service, that's very common. We support that as well. We also pass it into SQL so that you can operate against it inside your stored procedures. So all of that is what you would expect. We also support EasyAuth, by the way, which allows us to enable like Google ID and Apple ID and Microsoft ID and all those things as well. So a lot of capabilities just kind of sitting there waiting to be used. So really, really nice. On top of that, we have database policies. Database policies allow you to basically implement row-level security based on the claims that are passed into the data API. The data API can't be a security mechanism of itself, right? You want to be able to, you want to make the right tool, the right service, the right responsibility. It's really not for the data API. However, once you're authenticated and once you already have your authorization being passed through claims, we can then append predicates to the queries that you're doing. And this is nice because do you know how to do that in SQL? Do you know how to do row-level security in SQL? Maybe, and if not, we do it for you. Let's say you do, though. Do you also know how to do it in Postgres and in MySQL and in Cosmos DB? So we handle all of that for you. And just an example of some of the things we do, we allow you to interact with both the item and the claim, and then we concatenate and build out the predicate for you that gets appended to the query. So really nice. The engine level row level security is different. It's completely different. If you're going to do it that way, we support that as well. But this makes it so that if there are just so many situations where the developer doesn't have access to the underlying database, and so we want to give them the ability to do this. Okay, let me keep going. We also have the ability now to monitor. You can export all the operations of your data API directly up into application insights. You can also do it with OpenTelemetry, which is what almost everybody's doing now. So if you're like, I really would prefer using OpenTelemetry over application insights, which by the way has also migrated to OpenTelemetry, we support that as well. And we have additional custom traces coming in the next release. And if you're using .NET Aspire as your orchestration tool for all of your containers, then we support that as well in two different ways. One, we have all of our, that's one of the reasons we support OpenTelemetry is because it's so heavily dependent on it. But also because we now are a member of the community toolkit for .NET Aspire, which means you can go into your C# application and you can say builder.add data API builder. And you pass in a reference to your SQL Server, and immediately you have access to your SQL Server through a data API. It is spectacular. It is an incredible tool. So let me just remind you. So it is Azure SQL, which is the one in the cloud. It is SQL Box or SQL Server, the one that you would install on-prem. SQL MI, SQL on the edge, SQL Express. What do every SQL you can imagine. Like we are SQL Server, so we want to support everything. SQL data warehouse. By the way, inside Fabric, we expose a GraphQL endpoint. You maybe have already seen that if you've researched anything around Fabric. Guess what technology they're using to expose GraphQL inside Fabric? It's Data API Builder, right? And so Data API Builder is a very important part of the overall story inside SQL. And the fact that we expose it and give it to you for free so that you can use it as an isolated service is amazing. All right, great. Data warehouse, and just a quick glimpse into the command line and why this matters. The command line shows you that, or allows you to do everything reliably and repeatedly. No, you can repeat it and it's the same. What word am I looking for? And so that's really valuable, right? So I can go in and I can say, I want a configuration file. This is my connection string, and I want to do it this way. Right, so that's really, really great. And then I can go in more, and I could say, add this table, add this view. And what's happening is the JSON configuration file is just getting bigger. And can you go into a JSON file and edit it? Of course you can. Have you ever gone into a JSON file and forgotten a comma? Of course you have. We're all human. That happens over and over again. Why is the CLI so appealing? It is appealing because it makes it so that comma problem never occurs, right? And so if you've forgotten certain syntax or whatever, the CLI has not forgotten it for you, right? So it's really, really great. All right, let me show you a quick demo here in the last few minutes that I've got. It's more than enough time. The session is like, let's create a data API and let's go from there. Like it's unbelievable how fast it could be. So let me just show you. I have an empty folder here. And in it, in Visual Studio Code, which is the tool I'm running here, let me make it just a snap bigger. That's a little too big. Right? If that's too small, just interrupt me. I'm glad to make it a little bit bigger. And so I have the Omnibus. There we go. I have the Data API Builder Omnibus extension installed. That's this one right here. And so when you look at it, it actually includes many different Data API Builder extensions with it. And the Omnibus is just the umbrella over all of them to ensure that you get the latest and the right ones all the way across. There are a couple of Data API Builder extensions that exist thanks to our MVP community. And so those are really good. They're not included here because these are the ones specific from the team, right? It's from the team. And once it exists, I'm sorry, not once it exists, but once we have that installed, I can go to the folder and sort of get started. So let me start by just sharing this. Usually you wouldn't share credentials with a team, but I will just show over a presentation. But I just want to show you that I have a very simple and standard connection string to a local SQL that's running on my machine, right? So it's localhost. I have a database named Trek, and my username is SA, and there's my password. Now you know. All right. Now, more importantly, this is not user equals SA, it's user ID equals SA. There's kind of a quirk in the JavaScript driver that requires you use user ID instead of user. So this is one of the reasons I'm showing you that. I just don't want you to feel like there's some sort of like problem with you that Jerry never had. And the reason is often we will go to the easier user, which is valid when you're using .NET or any other, but in a JavaScript driver, it's user ID. If you didn't already know that, well, now you know. That's nice. All right, I already have it installed. I'm in an empty folder. I don't have the configuration file already created. So I will right-click that, and I will say dab init. So this is brand new, dab Data API Builder, and this is dab init. And so if I were to just jump back to the command line here, right? So I'm right here. So the first is just installing the tool. It's a cross-platform .NET tool, and that's why I can say .NET tool install, and then I can install Data API Builder. But once I have that, this is how I initialize the file that doesn't exist. So I can say dab init, and I could say this database type is going to be Microsoft SQL, and here's the connection string. So that's what I want to run, and that's the reason, here we go, when we right-click on an empty folder that doesn't have a configuration file, dab init is what it leads us to go to first. And so when I go to dab init, it asks me a couple of really easy things. The first one is, do you want to store all of your secrets inside an env file? If you're not familiar with an env file, It's a name value pair file. That's all that it is. That stores all of your environment variables, names, and their values. What's special about it is, one, I can make sure that this doesn't get checked in. So I can basically extract all of my secrets into a file that doesn't get put into my GitHub repository. The other thing that's really good about it is when it is executed and those values are brought into the environment, they're brought into the process scope of the environment, which means if they happen to clash with another project, application that you have out there, it doesn't really matter. These are isolated to the scope. Also, another piece of software out there that's running can't read these environment variables because they're isolated to the process scope. So really neat way to put all of your secrets in one place. If you're a JavaScript developer, you're probably already familiar with env files. If you're a .NET developer, this might be new to you. Right? This might be new. .NET tends to do it in different ways, right? Putting it in the launch JSON file, or sometimes in user secrets and things like that, or the project launch configuration file in Visual Studio. The next thing it asks is whether or not I want a manifest file. So a manifest inside .NET makes sure that I will install some .NET tool, in this case, the Data API Builder tool. If I don't have Data API Builder installed, this will basically invoke the installation for me. I already do. I'll leave it like that just so you can see it. The final one that's not checked by default is this configuration is used for static web apps. If you are going to use a static web app, it can't be called the typical dab config file. It has to be, it has a long DB connection, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it's easy to forget. So you have to go to the docs to find it, or check this checkbox and it'll just name it correctly for you. I'm not going to do that. We're going to do standard here. So I'll go ahead and say put all my secrets in env files. I'll go ahead and leave that manifest for now and click OK. And when it does, the only thing I need to provide to it now is the connection string. And so if I were, let me pass the connection string in. This is that same connection string that I just showed you a second ago. So when I hit enter, it is not going to go and build my JSON file for me. It is going to call and execute the command line for me, right? So you can see that the terminal opened up, and what's going on there? Read the file. Funny. It gave me an error, but it didn't fail. Strange. Well, pretend that didn't happen. And but let me show you what did happen. So here's my configuration file. If I were to click it, you can see all of the JSON is in there. Let me hide the terminal. And then you can also see here's my environment variable. So here's my connection string as well as my ASP.NET cores, where it's going to be launched and what my port is going to be. And then it also created a git ignore for me to make sure that my env file doesn't accidentally get checked into my repository. You may already have an env file, by the way, because your project may already have that. This appends to it. It doesn't override it. You may already have a git ignore. This appends to it. Doesn't override it as well. Because I didn't have that before, this was a totally empty folder. It just created the absolute basics. See this config, this .config folder? This is the manifest. So this is what .NET tooling looks for when it's trying to install something for you automatically. So remember when I was installing it, let me jump back one more time. And so remember when I installed it, it was .NET tool install Microsoft API Data API Builder -G. That -G installs it globally. Well, this installs it locally without the -G, which means this folder has this version of DAB installed. And so if I need to go to another folder and have a different version because backwards compatibility for something that you're running, that's fine too. That's the reason it works this way. So the manifest is for non-global installations. Okay, let's just look at this for a second together. This has a whole, so here's the connection string and the connection information all under the data source node. And then we have this runtime information that enables REST, enables graph, sets up some details around it, and then enables whatever your security might be and determines what mode you're running in. So if I'm in a production mode, I don't get, for example, Swagger, right? Or I don't get Banana Cake Pop, but in development mode, I do. And then these are all the entities that are currently identified to be exposed. So the tables, views, and stored procedures. Well, let's do, you can see it's empty, right? I haven't done that yet. So now I can right click on my configuration file and I have new DAB commands that I didn't have before. And I can go in and say, let's go and add a table. So I'm going to add a table. I have a whole slew of tables here. This is all it's my Star Trek database. And so I'll go in, let's just add them all so you can see what they look like. right? And so I'll say okay, and you can see it's not interacting with the JSON file. It's just running those command lines for you. So if there's a part of you you're like, man, I wonder what those command lines actually are supposed to be. The docs are clear, but I still don't get it. You can actually see what they look like because we execute them completely. And so if I go back into my JSON file, let me close this so we can see it. You can see entities is no longer empty, but here's actor, which is a table, right? So I describe the source as here's DBO actor, it's a table, and these are the key fields inside that table, right? And then when we go on down, I could say whether or not this participates in graph, whether or not it participates in REST, what the permissions are, because the permissions of the CRUD and E for execute are all available, but execute's only for a store procedure. Per item, right, so, which is what you would want, of course. And this is anonymous, but I could have authenticated as well as custom roles that I define as well. And I can also interact with my claims. I map it so that if I need to change the name, and so I make it so that, we don't expose ID, instead we expose key or something like that. So that's really nice. This can also exclude columns as well. If I'm like, oh, certain columns I don't want, well, I could say for this user, they don't get back birth year, for example. And then we go into character, the next one down, and it keeps on going from there. Now, if I were to right click, one of the things I can do is validate it. And a validation operation actually goes against the database and makes sure that everything that is inside the configuration file matches the configuration inside the database. So that has to do with things like data types, names, and things like that to make sure they're actually there. I can right click then again. So I just validated it. I can say, let's visualize it. And so now it pulls up. And so it could be hard to scroll through all that JSON. It's like, oh, here I have no store procedures, I have no views, and here are all the tables that I have. Wouldn't it be nice if these had a relationship? This matters most in GraphQL. And so I can right click here and I can say add again. And this time I can say, let's add a relationship between some of these tables. So it goes and sees all of the constraints that are predefined inside SQL for me. I'll just select them all for now. And these are all the ones. It doesn't have reciprocal types, not yet. And so if I add these, I'll say go for it, right? It runs all of you can see the command line here, dab update the character. Here's the config file it's going to update, and it adds the relationship, right? So if you're wondering how to do that, oh, we'll just show you. It's right here looking right at you. And so now if I update it, so this is still the old markdown. And so now if I update it again, what it's doing is it's writing this out. It's basically translating the JSON file into Markdown, and it uses mermaid graphs to be able to show you what they look like. Right, so here's all of the different relationships between each of them as well to allow me to be able to understand what it is. Let me just speak for a quick second on relationships. This tool looks to see all of the defined constraints that are already in SQL. But you may not have access to SQL, and you may not have those relationships defined, but you wish that you did. But because you don't have access, you never can. Well, inside the configuration file for Data API Builder, we allow you to define the relationship even if it doesn't exist. So even when you validate it, it doesn't go to see whether or not that relationship exists inside SQL. It just makes sure that all the data types of the keys match. That's it. That means that you can start creating a robust experience without requiring your database, your DBA, or maybe you just had a merger with another company and you can't even access that system in any significant schema-changing way. Now all of a sudden you can interact with it in a very intuitive way, right? We're creating relationships so that you can nest objects inside your GraphQL query. So really cool stuff there as well. Let me see here. The last thing you would do is start it, right? So I can run it and see what it looks like. So I'll start it, and it starts that fast. So this is the engine locally that was installed through the .NET Tool installation, and I can go in. Here's the endpoint, which opened on another window somewhere. Where did it open? Oh, here, no. That's funny. Just didn't come to the front. All right, so let me show you. Zoom in. All right, so this is the root. I haven't gone to any data yet. This is just where it's deployed. You can see that it's running and everything is operational. Healthy simply means that it can access the database. So now if I go to /API/ what was it? Actor, ACTOR. Right? There is the data coming back. Hopefully this feels like it is a fast process. I haven't done anything really technically difficult yet. Right? And so there's all the information that I would want. But it has on it all of the stuff that you would hope to have. So, for example, if I only wanted, let's see, name and birth year. No, just ID and name. ID, comma, name, right? So I have the ability to project my data in the way that I want it to be. So, right, I don't have to return all of the columns if I don't want them. I can also add other things where I could say and $ filter, right? Where filter equals ID is greater than 3, right? And so now all the IDs start at 4, right? And on they go. And so I can have a lot of capability instead of my REST endpoint that is just given to me for free because the engine enables all of this. I can also order by and some other things as well. So that's nice, right? It probably meets 99% of all of your requirements, and you haven't really had to do anything spectacular almost at all. And so in the last few minutes here, let me show you one other feature that we have that will just get you started, because it might be that your development team just has never done this before. That's not unrealistic. It sometimes that happens. Maybe you've never done it before. So you can right click on the JSON file. That's your configuration file. Right? I could delete this markdown. It doesn't matter. It just helps me to visualize it. If I go in and I right click this, I can see the whole set of operations and then the odd one here that says generate C#. So C# is all we generate today because we haven't built the one that generates Python and haven't built the one that generates Java and haven't built the one that generates JavaScript. And when I go in, it's like, well, what do you want to access? Well, let's just say actor for now. But I could access all of the objects that are defined inside the configuration file. I'll say OK to that because now I've limited the scope of what it is I want to go to. And am I just looking, let me just say it like this. Am I just looking for the models so that I can use it in my own implementation? Maybe. Am I trying to build the repository itself? I'm like, yeah, I absolutely want to do that. Have a generic repository that's tailored to the way Data API Builder is built. I'm like, yeah, I definitely want that. And what I want to implement the one that for actor, I totally do. And do I want to have a project so I can just see what this would look like overall? Yeah, sure. I can check these, uncheck these, delete what's created, and run it again. It just takes a couple of seconds. And so when I run this, and you can see the generation completed successfully. And you can see tons of new things have appeared, as well as the Solution Explorer turned on, right? And the reason it turned on is, let me collapse a few things, just walk you through what was created. Everything remains the same except for this folder, GenCS. And this GenCS, you're going to rename, right? This is just us creating something that you can see. And if I go into it, I have a solution called sample. I have a project called sample. And here's my program. And what does the program do? The first line here validates to make sure the endpoint is active and running and started, right? Because you could run your application and forget to start the engine. And then it goes and gets the basic information and spits it out to the screen. That's all that it does. But I'll just point out there's an API subfolder that includes all the logic. So you're like, I really wonder how to do this, and I don't want one of those dumb demos that Microsoft provides that doesn't have any realistic code. I'm like, well, we got it for you right here. This is realistic code in exactly the way you would likely do it in a structured, organized way. So there you go. Let me go ahead and let me do two things here. Let me restart the engine. So there we go. It's running. And then let me hide that. And then just let me hit F5. So when I hit F5, it asks me what language. That's the debugger that it's going to use. It asks me which project. It's funny that there's only one, but I'll take this one in Data Weekend. And it will ask me which project inside it. All right, so now it's running, and I hope that it runs. I hope that it runs so that you can see it in. Well, maybe you guys saw that, but it's told me that there was an error. I'll run it one last time. Where's the error? Partial modifier, can that be up here? Oh boy. Not going to be able to fix that fast enough in just a few minutes that we have left. But do know that so I have the non-production version of Omnibus, and I was trying to show off a little more than we've got ready, I guess. But what should happen is just a very simple terminal pops up and spits out all of the actors, just like if we went to the endpoint directly in a browser, like I showed you a second ago. The code is still here, but I've introduced some sort of error into it. But the generate CS is not C#, by the way, is not really meant to write your project for you, just to give you a starting point in case you don't know where to go, right? So if just even looking at this, you're like, oh, I've never, this is how you would interact with a repository. What does the repository look like? Well, I've got, the logic of the actor repository right here. Well, oh, this is how a repository might be laid out. There's a lot of education here just to kind of get you into a place where it is building a solution that you can actually use, and code that you can steal and then upgrade to be inside your real project. Now, the upside to this, the downside to this, right, is now you need to go and make it work, right? But that's the reason we're paid. We're engineers. However, the upside to this is it gives you 99% of all the code you're going to need. It also takes away a third of your code base with Data API Builder as well. So if you think about it from a practical sense, this should make it so that that POC that your manager is asking you to build, you can have done today. You can say, all right, yeah, I can absolutely have it, and here it is, and everything's ready to go. So let me start by just pointing you to the resources for Data API Builder. It's aka.ms/dab. That's where the repository is. At the top of the repository is a form where you can join the community and be part of the roadmap going forward as well. So it's a very active community. You're welcome to join. It's also open source. We welcome your pull requests as well. The last thing I want to just say is there is a applied skill. So if a lot of the new features inside SQL are, you feel like they're slipping through your fingers and you're not keeping up with them, we have an applied skill now that's coupled with a learning path so that you can learn all of those features. The applied skill it's not an exam. It is a cordoned off piece of Azure where you can prove that you understand how to use these, and then you can add that certificate or that credential that Microsoft provides to you to LinkedIn or wherever it is you want to show. Right? It's very cool, to be honest. As a reminder, SQL is free now. It is still something you have to pay for if you're a company, but for us, right, it's free, so we don't have to worry about unexpected charges or anything along those lines. If you haven't already discovered SQL database projects as well, SQL database projects at AKMS/SQL projects is how we put our schema into source control. There are two ways to do it. There are code first, which you see on the Entity Framework side of things, and then there is database first, which is the SQL database projects. Which one do you prefer? It's up to every team, right? You get to decide. Is one better than the other? It's up to every team. We support both of them. The Entity Framework side is very robust. The SQL database project side also very robust. If you're in Visual Studio, if you're in Code, or if you're in the CLI, right? All of those things are supported the way we would hope to. If Data API Builder is interesting to you, and I hope it is, it's one of the neatest things we've ever put together. The fact that it's free blows my mind. And the fact that we support on-prem and off, or in the cloud, the fact that we support every database, including not our own, stunning, right? Truly stunning. So here's a great place for you to potentially get started. You can have some of these resources as well. The bulk of everything, though, is going to be at https://aks/dab. And so you can install the Omnibus extension inside the VS Code and try what I was doing, right? Where you right-click inside an empty folder, you dab in it, then you add your tables, and then you start. And it runs that fast, right? You can generate some C# code. You can't hit F5, but you can still steal all the code. And it is a very well-formulated and prescriptive way of interacting with the Data API. You may already have a formulated way of interacting with the Data API. Of course, we support that too, because this is just HTTP and HTTPS with JSON going across the wire. So hopefully this makes sense. Hopefully this is appealing to you. I can tell you that I really do love talking about Data API Builder because it reduces so much complexity, and we as engineers already have to deal with so much complexity as well. So let me stop here, Justin, and just see if there are any questions that I can answer. Oh, there are no questions. I like to think that I speak so insanely clear that there are no, but if there are any, now's the right time.